sleet hit the mud of the town square like handfuls of gravel. A woman stood on the auction block, her knuckles white around a splintered wagon, spoke. Huddled behind her were 5 shivering boys, their coats practically holding together by dirt and desperation. The town's wealthy rancher offered a sack of flour for the 2 oldest. Nobody wanted the little ones. Then a man stepped out of the timberline shadows. He smelled of bare grease, pine pitch, and deep isolation. The wind whipping through Oak Haven didn't just bite, it gnawed. It found the gaps in floorboards, the fraying threads of cheap wool collars, the hollow spaces beneath the ribs of hungry people. Gideon stood on the covered porch of Miller's Mercantile, a burlap sack of coarse salt slung over one massive canvas-clad shoulder. He tasted copper and ash in the back of his throat. A winter cough he hadn't quite shaken. He shifted his weight, favoring his left knee, a lingering souvenir from a badly healed timber fracture a decade gone. He hated town. He hated the smell of it, wet dog cheap rye, whiskey, unwashed bodies crammed together, and the sour tang of nervous sweat. Up on the ridge, the air smelled like pine needles and crushed ice. Here it just smelled like failure. He was supposed to tie the salt to his mule, buy 2 pounds of Arbuckles' coffee, and ride back up the timberline before the storm broke. Instead, he found himself watching the miserable spectacle unfolding in the center of the muddy thoroughfare. A flatbed wagon had been parked in front of the bank. Standing on it was a woman. Nora. Gideon didn't know her name, but he knew the type. Back straight jaw clamped so tight the muscles twitched beneath her pale skin. Her dress was a faded calico, patched so many times it resembled a bruised quilt. Her hands were raw, chapped red, gripping a broken wagon, spoke like she fully intended to brain the next man who stepped close. Behind her, clumped together like a litter of half-drowned pups, were 5 boys. The oldest looked maybe 14 tall, but thin as a reed, his wrists protruding 3 inches from his coat sleeves. The youngest couldn't have been more than 4. He had his face buried in the oldest boy's hip, coughing a wet, rattling sound that carried over the wind. They were the O'Bannon kids. Gideon had heard the gossip inside the Mercantile. The father took a kick from a spooked draft horse in September. The mother didn't last a month after taken by a lung fever. The bank foreclosed by November. Now the town was figuring out what to do with the leftovers. Standing in the mud below the wagon was Benton, a cattleman who owned half the valley and acted like he owned the rest. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat, chewing a cigar that had long gone out. "I'm telling you, girl, it's a fair trade." Benton's voice was a loud, flat bray. "I'll clear the remaining $15 of your daddy's debt. I'll take the older 2. Put 'em to work, mucking out the winter stalls. They'll get half rations and a spot in the barn loft." The oldest boy, trembling but trying to puff his narrow chest, stepped forward. "We're 5 brothers. We don't split up. You take us all or you take nobody." Benton laughed, a wet, phlegmy sound. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the frozen mud right near the wagon wheel. "Boy, you ain't in no position to negotiate. Nobody keeps more than 2. Not in this economy. Not with a winter this heavy coming down. You 3 little ones go to the orphanage in Denver on the Friday train. The girl can wash dishes over at the saloon. That's the deal." Gideon watched the woman. He saw the way her chest hitched a tiny, involuntary spasm of sheer panic before she forced it down. She tightened her grip on the wood. "I said no, Mr. Benton." "Ain't up to you, Nora." The banker, a squirrel-faced man named Higgins, piped up from the safety of the boardwalk. "The county took custody of the debt. The county makes the arrangements." Gideon ran a thumb over his bearded jaw. The hairs were stiff, dusted with frost. He turned away. "Not your circus, old man," he told himself. "You got salt, you got coffee. Get up the mountain." He took one step toward his mule. Then The youngest boy on the wagon sneezed. It wasn't the sound that stopped Gideon. It was the way the boy wiped his nose on his sleeve, looked up at his sister, and whimpered a single word. Cold. It was a small, pathetic sound. Gideon closed his eyes. The phantom ache in his knee flared. He remembered a winter in Montana 20 years ago. He remembered a younger brother who had made that exact same sound, right before he stopped making sounds altogether. "Damn it!" Gideon muttered. The words tasted like old leather. He didn't stride heroically into the square. He trudged. His heavy leather boots, coated in bear grease and beeswax, made a wet, sucking sound in the muck. The crowd of onlookers, about 20 townsfolk huddled in their coats, parted for him instinctively. He was a massive man, broad through the chest, his face half hidden by a wild, greying beard and the low brim of a slouch hat. Benton stopped chewing his cigar as Gideon stopped right beside him. "You lost, Mountain Man?" Benton asked, his eyes narrowing. Gideon didn't look at Benton. He looked up at the wagon, at Nora. Her eyes were a flat, stormy grey. She didn't look relieved. She looked at him the way a cornered fox looks at a hound. "What's the full paper?" Gideon asked. His voice was gravelly, unused to doing much more than calling to mules and cursing at trapped coyotes. Higgins blinked from the boardwalk. "Excuse me." "The debt. The total. Not Benton's discount. The whole damn thing." Gideon turned his head, slightly glaring at the banker. $32.80. Higgins stammered. Gideon reached into the heavy wool pocket of his coat. He didn't carry paper notes. Paper burned, tore, and rotted. He pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He didn't toss it. He walked over to the boardwalk and dropped it heavily onto the wooden planks at Higgins's feet. It landed with a dense, metallic thud. "There's 2 double eagles in there," Gideon said, his voice dropping a register sounding like grinding stones. "Keep the change. Rip up the paper." A heavy silence fell over the square. The wind howled, rattling the mercantile sign, but nobody spoke. Benton stepped forward, his face flushing red beneath his collar. "Hold on a minute. You can't just buy a whole family's debt, you crazy old bear. What are you going to do with 5 scrawny boys up on that rock of yours? You can't feed 'em. And like I told the kid, nobody keeps more than 2. It ain't practical. It ain't natural." Gideon finally turned to look at Benton. He didn't puff out his chest. He didn't look angry. He just looked bone-tired. "I ain't nobody," Gideon muttered. He looked back up at the wagon. The oldest boy was staring at him, mouth slightly open. The woman Nora was still gripping her makeshift club. "My table seats 8. Gideon said, his voice barely carrying over the wind, yet every word landed like a physical weight. "Been staring at 6 empty chairs for 10 long years. I'm sick of the quiet." He didn't wait for a reaction. He didn't look for gratitude. He turned his back on them and began walking toward his wagon, parked near the livery. "Get in the back. There's a canvas tarp. Hide under it before the mare freezes." On the wagon, the oldest boy, Caleb, let out a shaky breath that turned into a sudden, violently loud sob. The sound broke the tension. The other boys began to cry, clinging to each other. Nora didn't cry, but her hands shook so badly she dropped the piece of wood. It clattered against the flatbed. She stared at Gideon's retreating back, her eyes wide, realizing the executioner had just opened the cell door. The wagon ride was a miserable, bone-rattling affair. Gideon sat on the driver's bench, the thick collar of his coat turned up against the biting sleet. He kept his eyes on the rear end of his mule, refusing to look back at the cargo he had just acquired. He felt a deep, churning nausea in his gut. It wasn't the cold. It was the crushing realization of his own stupidity. 5 boys. And a woman. He was a man who measured his life in winter cords of wood ounces of coffee and pounds of salted meat. He knew exactly how much he needed to survive until the spring thaw. He had enough to feed himself. He did not have enough to feed a small army of starving orphans. He'd have to hunt, every damn day, in the deep snow. He'd have to track elk, set more snare lines, maybe drop a moose if he could find one, down in the willow bogs. Behind him, beneath the heavy oiled canvas tarp, there was mostly silence. Occasionally, a suppressed cough or the shuffle of boots on the wooden bed. Nora sat nearest to the front, directly behind the wooden bench, her back pressed against the rough pine boards. The cold was seeping through her thin dress, turning her skin numb, but she barely felt it. Her mind was racing a frantic tally of risks and survival odds. She watched the broad, dark silhouette of the mountain man driving the wagon. He hadn't said a word to them since they climbed in. He hadn't asked their names. He hadn't offered a blanket. He just flicked the reins and started up the steep, winding logging road that left the town of Oakhaven far behind. He wants something Nora thought her nails digging into her palms. Men don't throw $40 into the mud for nothing. She had spent the last 2 months fighting off vultures, the banker who wanted the land, the rancher who wanted cheap, disposable labor, the saloon owner who had looked at her with oily, measuring eyes. This man, this Gideon, was just a different kind of predator. Maybe he wanted a captive workforce for his timber claim. Maybe he wanted a woman stranded miles from civilization. She reached into her skirt pocket. Her fingers brushed the cold, hard steel of a small paring knife. The blade was only 3 inches long, dull from peeling potatoes, but it was all she had. She kept her hand in her pocket. "Are we going to die up here, Nora?" The whisper came from Arthur, the 10-year-old. He was huddled beneath the canvas, his teeth chattering so hard it sounded like castanets. "No!" Nora whispered back, her voice harsh and flat. "We're not dying today. Just keep your brothers warm." The climb took 3 hours. The sleet turned to heavy, wet snow as they gained elevation. The pine trees closed in around them, massive sentinels blocking out the fading grey light of the afternoon. The world narrowed down to the sound of hooves slipping on iced rocks, the creak of the wagon axles, and the relentless sigh of the wind through the needles. When the wagon finally lurched to a halt, the sudden lack of motion made Nora's stomach heave. Gideon wrapped the reins around the brake lever and climbed down. He walked to the back of the wagon and threw off the canvas tarp. "Out," he grunted. Nora blinked against the sudden flurry of snow. She looked around. There was no sprawling ranch, no logging camp, just a cabin. It was built of massive, unpeeled pine logs, chinked with mud and dried moss. The roof was pitched steep to shed the snow covered in rough-hewn shakes. A thin ribbon of smoke curled lazily from a fieldstone chimney. It looked less like a house, and more like a natural growth of the mountain itself, dark-weathered and entirely isolated. "Get inside," Gideon said, pointing a thick, calloused finger toward the heavy oak door. "Boots off on the porch. I don't want mud on my floor." Caleb, the oldest, scrambled out first, his joints stiff from the cold. He reached up to help the smaller boys down. Nora climbed out last. She didn't let go of the knife in her pocket. Gideon didn't wait for them. He walked past them, unlatching the door and kicking it open. Nora ushered the boys inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the sheer force of the heat hit her like a physical blow. The cabin was a single, massive room. The air was thick, heavy, with the smell of wood smoke, rendered tallow-curing hides, and the sharp tang of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. It wasn't cozy, it was rugged and brutally functional. A massive stone hearth dominated the far wall, a bed of red coals glowing fiercely. Cast-iron pans hung from iron hooks. A large, scarred wooden table sat in the center of the room, flanked by heavy wooden chairs. 6 empty chairs. Just like he said. There was a large bed in the corner, covered in a thick bearskin. In the opposite corner, a pile of folded wool blankets sat on top of a cedar chest. Gideon walked in behind them, shutting the door. The immediate silence of the room was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wet, ragged breathing of the boys. Gideon didn't look at them. He walked straight to the hearth, picked up an iron poker, and stabbed at the logs, sending up a shower of sparks. "Sit at the table," he ordered, his back to them. The boys scrambled to obey, pulling out the heavy chairs, their eyes darting around the room, taking in the mounted elk antlers, the traps hanging on the walls, the long rifle resting on pegs above the door. Nora remained standing near the door, water dripping from the hem of her dress onto the braided rag rug. Gideon turned around. He looked at the boys sitting rigidly at his table. He looked at Nora standing by the door. He rubbed his face with both hands, letting out a long, exhausted sigh. He walked over to a cupboard, pulled out a heavy earthenware crock and brought it to the table. He pried off the wooden lid. Inside were thick, dark strips of smoked venison jerky. He grabbed a handful and tossed them onto the center of the table. They hit the wood with a dry clatter. "Eat," he said. "Yeah." The boys hesitated, looking at Nora. She gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Caleb reached out first, grabbing a piece. Within seconds, the boys were tearing at the tough meat like starved wolves, the silence of the cabin replaced by the sound of frantic chewing. Gideon watched them for a moment, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Then he looked at Nora. "You gonna stand there dripping all night, or you gonna sit down?" Nora didn't move. "Where do we sleep?" she asked. Her voice was steady, challenging. Gideon frowned. He pointed a thumb toward the cedar chest. "Blankets are there. You pull 'em close to the hearth. Floor's drafty, but it won't kill you." "And what do we do tomorrow?" She pushed her knuckles white inside her pocket. "You bought our debt. That makes us your labor." "What are the rules?" Gideon stopped. He stared at her, really looking at her for the first time. He saw the defensive posture, the wild, trapped look in her eyes. He saw the way her hand was buried in her pocket, shaped around something small and hard. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of irritation, followed immediately by a wave of profound weariness. He walked toward her, slowly. Nora tensed, backing up half a step, until her shoulders hit the heavy wood of the door. Gideon stopped 3 feet away. He towered over her, smelling of wet wool and cold sweat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to sound gentle. "Listen to me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I ain't Benton. I ain't looking for cheap labor, and I ain't looking for a maid. I bought your debt because that fat bastard down there was going to split up 5 brothers, and I couldn't stomach the sound of it." He pointed a finger at the table where the boys were still gnawing on the jerky, watching them with wide, terrified eyes. "The rules are simple," Gideon said, his gaze locking onto Nora's. "You keep the fire fed, you don't touch my rifle, and you don't go wandering off into the timberline, because the wolves out here don't care how sad your story is." He turned away from her, walking back toward the hearth. "Now sit down and eat a piece of meat before you fall over. I ain't digging a grave in frozen ground." Night fell over the mountain like a heavy iron lid. Outside, the wind screamed through the pines, hurling sleet against the single glass window panes with the violence of thrown gravel. Inside the cabin was a pocket of suffocating heat and thick tension. Gideon sat in an armchair by the fire, a piece of oilcloth in his lap, methodically cleaning a disassembled revolver. He didn't look up, but he felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on him. The boys were huddled on the floor near the hearth. They had pulled the wool blankets from the chest and nested together like a litter of feral cats. The youngest, Leo, was asleep, his head resting on Caleb's stomach. The others were awake, staring at the flames, occasionally shooting nervous glances at the giant man with the gun. Nora wasn't sitting. The moment the meal of tough jerky and stale water was finished, she had gone into a frantic, silent frenzy of activity. It was a trauma response, though Gideon wouldn't have known the word for it. She couldn't sit still. She couldn't accept charity without attempting to pay for it immediately with sweat. She found a bucket of water near the door, grabbed a rag that looked clean enough, and began scrubbing the long wooden table. Gideon watched her out of the corner of his eye. The table was already clean. He had scrubbed it himself with lye soap 2 days ago, but she attacked it as if it were coated in grease, her thin arms flexing her breath, coming in short, sharp hitches through her nose. Scrape, scrub, scrape. The sound grated on Gideon's nerves. He liked quiet. He had bought them to fill the silence, yes, but this wasn't the kind of noise he wanted. This was the noise of panic. He slid the cylinder back into the revolver with a sharp click. Nora flinched her scrubbing, pausing for half a second before resuming with twice the ferocity. "Table's clean," Gideon said. His voice was rough, unaccustomed to the delicate negotiation of living with another human being. Nora didn't look up. "There's dirt in the grain," she muttered, digging her fingernails into the rag, scrubbing at a dark knot in the pine. "It's sap stain. It ain't coming out." "I can get it." "Stop scrubbing the damn table." He didn't shout, but the absolute command in his tone made the boys by the fire stiffen. Caleb put a protective hand over his sleeping brother's ear. Nora froze. She stood over the table, her hands flat against the wet wood, her head bowed. The firelight caught the sharp angles of her shoulders, the prominent ridges of her spine, visible through the thin fabric of her dress. She was shivering, though the cabin was easily 70 degrees. Gideon set the revolver down on the side table. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're trying to prove you're useful." He said the words heavy and blunt. "You're trying to show me you're worth the money I spent, so I don't throw you back out in the snow." Nora's head snapped up. Her eyes were wet, but there were no tears falling, just a furious glassy sheen. "I am useful. I can cook, I can mend, I can clean, I can pull my weight." "I don't doubt it," Gideon replied, his face impassive. "But you can't scrub a sap stain out of a pine board, and you're making me tired just watching you." He stood up. He was 6'4", broad across the chest, casting a massive shadow that danced across the log walls. He walked over to the table. Nora instinctively took a step back, her hand moving toward her pocket again. Gideon ignored the movement. He reached out and took the wet rag from her hand. He didn't grab her skin, just pinched the fabric and pulled it away. He tossed it into the wooden sink bucket. "Look around you," Gideon said, gesturing to the cabin. Nora looked. She saw the stacks of split firewood perfectly aligned by the door. She saw the jars of pickled vegetables lined up with military precision on the shelves. She saw the floorboards swept clean of dust. "I've lived up here alone for 10 years. Gideon said, his voice dropping into a quiet, raspy hum. "Woods chopped, waters drawn, meats smoked. I didn't bring you up here to be my maid. I don't need a maid." "Then what do you need?" Nora challenged, her voice trembling, stripping away the last of her polite veneer. "Men don't buy people just to be kind. Kindness died out here a long time ago. So tell me what you want, so I know what I have to do to keep my brothers safe." Gideon looked at her. He saw the terrifying vulnerability beneath the fierce exterior. He saw the calluses on her hands, the bruises fading on her wrists, from where someone had likely grabbed her too hard in town. He didn't know how to explain it. He didn't know how to articulate the suffocating weight of a decade of silence, how the sound of his own breathing had started to sound like a ghost in the dark. How he had started talking to the Timberwolves just to hear a voice. He looked over at the hearth. The boys were watching him. Arthur, the 10-year-old, had a smear of soot on his cheek. Gideon turned back to Nora. He didn't offer a gentle smile. He didn't have one to give. 10 years ago, Gideon started his voice barely above a whisper. I had a wife, and I had 2 boys, twins. We came up here to stake a timber claim. It was a bad winter, like this one. The snow, dumped early, blocked the pass. We ran out of food. He swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the quiet room. I went out to hunt, tracked an elk for 3 days. When I got back, the cabin was cold. The fever had taken them all, while I was out chasing tracks in the snow. Nora's breath caught. The defensive tension in her shoulders broke just a fraction. Gideon looked at the floorboards, staring at a knot in the wood. I buried them out back, under the big spruce, and I sat in this room for 10 years, listening to the wind, listening to the silence. It gets so quiet up here, you start hearing the blood rushing in your own ears, and you think it's someone whispering your name. He looked up at Nora, his dark eyes entirely hollow. I told Benton the truth down in the mud, Gideon said. I don't need hands. I need noise. I need people breathing in this room so I know I'm still alive. So you want to know your job? Your job is to sit by that fire, keep your brothers warm, and let me hear you breathe. He turned away from her, walking back to his armchair. He picked up his revolver, the metal cold and familiar in his massive hands. Go to sleep, Nora, he muttered, not looking back. We got a lot of snow to survive tomorrow. Nora stood by the table for a long time. The cynical, hardened shell she had built around herself over the last 2 months felt suddenly brittle, cracked by the blunt force of a broken man's honesty. She looked at the giant sitting in the chair, a man who smelled of blood and pine, who looked like a monster, but guarded the door like a sentinel. Slowly she walked over to the hearth. She knelt down beside Caleb, pulling the thick wool blanket up over his shoulders. She sat on the hard floor, leaning her back against the warm stones of the fireplace. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, listening to the wind batter the walls. But for the first time in months, as she listened to the deep, steady breathing of the mountain man in the chair, she let her hand slip out of her pocket, leaving the small knife behind. The cold didn't wake them. The smell did. It was a sharp, bitter aroma that cut through the lingering scent of unwashed bodies and damp wool. Nora opened her eyes to the dim grey light filtering through the frosted window panes. Her neck ached a dull throb, radiating down her spine from sleeping on the hard planks. Gideon was already up. He stood by the hearth, fully dressed in his canvas trousers and a faded flannel shirt, grinding roasted coffee beans in a small iron mill cranked by hand. The cruck, cruck, cruck sound was rhythmic, mercilessly loud in the quiet cabin. Nora sat up instinctively, pulling the blanket tighter around Leo, who was still asleep beside her. Caleb Arthur and the 2 middle boys, Samuel and Wyatt, were stirring, groaning, as the morning cold seeped into their joints. The fire had been banked overnight, leaving the cabin frigid, the air biting at their noses and ears. Gideon didn't offer a morning greeting. He dumped the coarse grounds into a battered blue enamel pot, added water from a tin bucket, and shoved it directly into the hot coals. "Boots on," Gideon grunted, not looking at them. "Daylight's burning and the wood box is half empty." Nora scrambled to her feet, smoothing down her wrinkled dress. "They're just boys," she said, her voice raspy from sleep. "Let them wake up." Gideon turned, fixing her with a stare that held zero patience. Winter doesn't care how old they are. Neither does the stove. If they want to stay warm, they chop. If they want to drink, they haul. He pointed a thick finger at Caleb. You, tallest one. Grab the splitting maul by the door. Wood piles on the south wall. Don't hack at your shins. Caleb blinked, still half asleep, but he nodded quickly. He shoved his feet into his worn boots and grabbed his thin coat. Gideon watched the boy shrug on the pathetic garment. The wind howled outside, rattling the heavy door on its iron hinges. Gideon sighed a harsh outward breath through his nose. He walked over to the cedar chest, rummaged inside, and pulled out an old moth-eaten wool coat. It was easily 3 sizes too big, meant for a grown man. He threw it at Caleb. The heavy fabric hit the boy in the chest, nearly knocking him backward. "Put that on over yours," Gideon commanded. "You freeze to death out there. I ain't digging you out of the snowbank until April." He looked at the other boys. Arthur and Samuel were huddled together, wide awake and terrified. Wyatt, only 6, had his thumb in his mouth. "You 3, Gideon said. "Grab the tin pails. The creek is out back, 50 yards down the slope. The ice will be thick. There's an iron spud bar leaning against the porch. Break the ice, fill the buckets. Don't fall in." Nora stepped forward, her maternal instincts flaring. "I'll go with them. They could slip." "No," Gideon said, his voice flat. He pointed to the massive iron skillet hanging above the stove. "You're on the bacon. There's a slab of salt pork in the pantry box. Slice it thick. Cornmeal's in the sack next to it. You said you could pull your weight. Prove it." He didn't wait for her to argue. He grabbed his own heavy buffalo hide coat, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and walked out the door, letting a blast of freezing, snow-laden wind into the room before pulling it shut behind him. The cabin descended into a stunned silence, broken only by the hiss of the coffee pot boiling over into the coals. Nora looked at the boys. They looked back at her, waiting for permission. "Go," she said softly, walking toward the pantry. "Do what he says. Keep your heads down. We just have to survive the winter." Caleb dragged the heavy maul out the door, the younger boys following with the buckets. Nora was left alone with sleeping Leo. She found the salt pork. It was rock hard, caked in coarse salt, smelling of brine and smoke. She found a heavy butcher knife and began to slice. The meat fought her, the fat, cold and unyielding, but she pressed her weight onto the blade, forcing it through. She sliced until her palms blistered. She mixed the cornmeal with water and bacon grease, forming rough patties. She was entirely out of her element in this massive masculine kitchen, but the fear of being deemed useless drove her. By the time Gideon returned an hour later, his beard coated in a thick layer of frost, the cabin smelled of frying grease and toasted corn. Caleb followed him in, dragging a canvas sling full of split pine. The boy was panting, his face flushed red from the cold and exertion, but his eyes held a glimmer of stubborn pride. The younger boys stumbled in after their pants, wet to the knees from the creek water, lugging the heavy pails. Gideon unlaced his boots and kicked them into the corner. He walked over to the stove, grabbed a rag, and lifted the coffee pot. He poured himself a tin cup, black and thick as crude oil. He took a sip, his eyes scanning the cast-iron skillet, the stacked firewood, the sloshing water buckets. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a word of praise. "Eat," he said, pulling out his chair at the head of the table. "Then we check the trap lines." The glare of the morning sun off the fresh snow was blinding. It was a vicious, crystalline white that burned the retinas and made the world look flat and hostile. The air was so cold it felt like inhaling ground glass. Gideon trudged through the knee-deep powder, his massive snowshoes leaving wide, oval tracks. Caleb walked directly behind him, stepping exactly into the compressed snow of Gideon's footprints to save his own energy. Samuel, the 8-year-old, brought up the rear, struggling to keep his short legs moving. Gideon hadn't asked Samuel to come, but the boy had followed them out the door, terrified of being left behind with the women's work, trying desperately to mimic his older brother. They had been walking for an hour. The silence of the timberline was absolute, stripped of all summer noises. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the squeak of dry snow beneath their boots and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Gideon stopped beside a dense thicket of frosted willow branches. He knelt down, brushing the fresh powder away with a gloved hand. Caleb and Samuel caught up their chests, heaving. They peered over Gideon's broad shoulder. A copper wire snare anchored to a heavy pine branch had been tripped. Caught by its hind leg was a snowshoe hare. It was massive, its winter coat, perfectly camouflaged against the drift. It wasn't dead. As Gideon cleared the snow, the hare thrashed violently, its eyes rolling in terror, the wire cutting deep into the flesh of its leg. The snow around it was stained a bright, shocking crimson. Samuel turned his face away, letting out a small, sickened whimper. Caleb stared at the blood. His stomach, full of heavy bacon and cornmeal, did a slow, uneasy roll. He had gutted chickens back on his father's farm, but this felt different. This was wild, desperate, and raw. Gideon didn't look at the boys. He reached out with a massive hand and pinned the thrashing hare to the snow by the scruff of its neck. "Take your gloves off, Caleb," Gideon said quietly. Caleb froze. "Sir." "Take 'em off. Grab the back legs." Caleb hesitated. His hands were shaking. He pulled off his wool mittens, the freezing air immediately biting into his knuckles. He reached down his fingers, brushing the incredibly soft, warm fur of the animal. He grabbed the hind legs. The hare kicked with astonishing force, its claws scratching Caleb's wrists. "Pull!" Gideon instructed, his voice devoid of emotion. "Pull until it's taut. Don't yank. Just stretch." Caleb pulled. The hare let out a high-pitched, thin shriek that sounded horrifyingly close to a human infant. Samuel clamped his hands over his ears. "Now," Gideon said, his grip on the scruff tightening. "Watch my hand." Gideon placed the edge of his right palm at the base of the hare's skull. With a swift, sharp, downward strike, there was a wet snap. The hare instantly went limp. The awful shrieking stopped. The silence rushed back into the woods heavier than before. Caleb dropped the legs, gasping as if he had been the one holding his breath. He stumbled back, wiping his bare, trembling hands on his coat. Gideon picked up the dead hare by the ears. He unlooped the bloody wire from its leg and tossed the carcass to Caleb. "Put it in the sack," Gideon said, pointing to the canvas bag slung over Caleb's shoulder. Caleb fumbled with the heavy, warm body, his face pale. It was looking at me." Gideon stood up, towering over the boy. He didn't look angry, but his eyes were hard like chips of flint. "It's a harsh country, boy," Gideon said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "It doesn't care if you're hungry. It doesn't care if you're sad. Everything out here eats something else to stay alive. You think Benton would have treated you any better than I treated this rabbit?" Caleb swallowed hard, staring at the blood soaking into the snow. "No, your sister," Gideon continued, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly timbre. "She's wearing a dress thin enough to read a newspaper through, and she's trying to hold 5 of you together. She's carrying a weight that's going to break her spine before the spring thaw." Gideon reached out and tapped the canvas sack against Caleb's chest. The heavy thud knocked the boy back a half step. "You're 14, Gideon said. "You ain't a boy anymore. Not up here. You carry the meat. You learn to kill clean. You learn to chop until your hands bleed. Because if you don't, I'm going to be burying her out back before April. Do you understand me?" Caleb looked up at the giant mountain man. The fear in the boy's eyes slowly hardened into something else. Something brittle but strong. "Yes, sir," Caleb whispered. "Good." Gideon turned his back on them, adjusting his snowshoes. "We got 6 more snares to check." Keep up." By nightfall, the cabin was a fortress against the dark. The wind had picked up again, shrieking down the chimney and making the flames in the hearth dance frantically. Dinner was the hare stewed in the cast-iron pot with dried wild onions and tough carrots from Gideon's root cellar. The boys ate in silence, exhausted from the day's labor. Caleb ate with a grim mechanical determination, refusing to look at the meat in his bowl. Nora sat by the hearth, a bowl of broth in her lap. She was trying to feed Leo, the 4-year-old. "Come on, sweetie," she coaxed, blowing on the wooden spoon. "Just a little bit. It'll make you strong." Leo didn't open his mouth. He was lying on the braided rug, wrapped in 2 wool blankets. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy red, yet he shivered violently. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Suddenly the boy's chest hitched. He let out a cough that didn't sound like a normal winter hack. It sounded wet, deep, and heavy, like mud bubbling in a hot spring. It was a thick rattling noise that seemed to echo in the cavernous room. Gideon, who was wiping down his rifle at the table, froze. The rag in his hand stopped mid-stroke. Rattle. Hack. Wheeze. The sound bypassed Gideon's ears and drove straight into his marrow. His chest seized. The cabin around him seemed to blur the smell of the hare stew, suddenly replaced by the phantom stench of sour sweat, burning sage and death. He saw a flash of his wife's pale face, the blue tint of his twins' lips. He dropped the rifle. It hit the wooden table with a loud wooden clack that made everyone jump. Gideon stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the small bundle of blankets near the fire. He walked over his heavy boots, sounding like a death knell on the floorboards. Nora looked up, panic flaring in her eyes. She pulled Leo closer to her chest. "He's just cold. He just needs rest." Gideon didn't listen. He dropped to his knees beside them, grabbing the blankets and tearing them back. Nora cried out in protest, but Gideon ignored her. He pressed his massive, calloused hand against the boy's forehead. It was like touching a hot stove. The boy's skin was clammy, radiating a dry, burning heat. "No," Gideon whispered. The word was a raw, jagged exhalation. He leaned down, pressing his ear directly against Leo's narrow chest. He listened for 3 seconds. He heard the friction, the fluid building in the delicate tissues. Lung fever, pneumonia, the exact same thief that had emptied his house 10 years ago. Gideon stood up so fast he nearly knocked Nora over. His eyes were wild, fully possessed by a decade-old terror. "Caleb!" Gideon roared his voice, shaking the rafters. "Get the wash boiler from the pantry, fill it with snow, pack it tight, put it on the stove, and build the fire until the iron glows red." Caleb scrambled over the bench, nearly tripping in his haste, sprinting toward the pantry. "Arthur Samuel!" Gideon barked, pointing at the terrified middle boys. "Get every blanket in this cabin. Pile them on the bed. Go!" Nora grabbed Gideon's pant leg. "What is it? What's wrong with him?" Gideon looked down at her. The cynical, hardened mountain man was gone. In his place was a desperate, panicked father fighting a ghost. "His lungs are drowning," Gideon rasped. "He's cooking from the inside out." Gideon turned and sprinted toward the door. He didn't grab his coat. He didn't put on his boots. He threw the heavy oak door open, rushing out into the blinding, freezing blizzard in his socks and shirt sleeves. Nora screamed his name, but the wind swallowed the sound. Inside the cabin erupted into chaotic action. Caleb was violently shoveling snow from the porch into a massive copper boiler, dragging it onto the stove, his face streaked with tears of panic. The middle boys were dragging heavy wool and bear hides onto Gideon's bed in the corner. 10 minutes passed. The water in the boiler began to hiss. Leo's breathing grew shallower, his skin taking on a terrifying waxy pallor. Nora sat beside him, weeping silently, rocking him back and forth, entirely helpless. The door banged open. Gideon practically fell inside, accompanied by a blast of snow. He was covered in white powder, his hands bleeding and caked with frozen dirt. In his arms, he held a massive bundle of dark, twisted roots and pale, frozen bark. He kicked the door shut and rushed to the stove. His hands were shaking so badly, he dropped half the roots onto the floor. He ignored them, taking the butcher knife Nora had used that morning, and furiously hacking the remaining roots into chunks. "Busher root!" he muttered frantically, more to himself than anyone else. "Willow bark, bare root, break the fever, open the chest." He swept the hacked pieces into the boiling water. Instantly, a pungent, incredibly bitter smell filled the cabin, a smell of damp earth, medicinal sap, and raw turpentine. "Bring him here," Gideon yelled at Nora. Nora carried Leo to the stove. Gideon took a small three-legged wooden stool and kicked it close to the heat. He grabbed a heavy canvas tarp from the corner. "Sit," Gideon ordered Nora. She sat on the stool, clutching her dying brother. Gideon dragged the boiling, steaming copper pot off the stove, resting it on the stone hearth, right between Nora's feet. The bitter steam plumed upward in a thick cloud. Gideon threw the heavy canvas tarp completely over Nora and Leo, creating a dark, suffocating tent over the boiling water. "Breathe it in," Gideon yelled through the canvas. "Make him breathe it. Don't let him turn his head." Underneath the tarp it was a dark, scalding hell. The heat was unbearable, the steam burning Nora's eyes and throat. The smell was overwhelmingly bitter, making her gag. But she held Leo tight against her chest, positioning his small face directly over the rising vapor. Outside the tarp, Gideon paced the floorboards like a caged, starved bear. He rubbed his face, smearing dirt and blood across his frozen beard. He looked at the heavy timber ceiling, his jaw tight, his chest heaving. Not again, he thought, the words repeating in his head like a broken, desperate prayer. "You took mine. You don't get this one. You don't get to take this one." He walked over to the tarp, pressing his ear against the heavy canvas, listening past the bubbling water, past Nora's quiet sobbing, straining to hear the sound of the boy's rattling lungs fighting for air. An hour crawled by, then 2. The fire in the hearth burned down to a deep, pulsing cherry red, but the cabin felt like a kiln. Under the heavy canvas tarp, Nora was suffocating. The bitter steam coated her lungs, tasting of black earth and tree sap. Her dress was plastered to her skin, drenched in a mixture of condensation and terror sweat. In her arms, Leo was a limp weight, his small chest juddering with every inhalation. The wet rattling sound hadn't stopped. It seemed to have settled deeper into his throat, a stubborn plug of infection, refusing to let go. Nora shifted her legs, cramping in the intense heat. Her vision blurred. The air was getting too thin. Suddenly the canvas was ripped away. Cold air rushed in, hitting Nora so hard she gasped, her lungs expanding violently. Gideon stood over them, his broad chest heaving, his face covered in soot and sweat. He didn't ask how she was doing. He didn't offer a gentle word. He reached down and took Leo from her arms. "Step back," Gideon grunted. Nora was too weak to fight him. She slumped against the stone hearth, drawing in greedy mouthfuls of the cool, dry air. Gideon sat on the three-legged stool. He didn't put the tarp back over them. Instead, he cradled the tiny burning boy against his chest. He took the copper boiler, now half empty, but still steaming violently, and pulled it tightly between his own boots. He bent his head, forming a canopy, with his massive shoulders over the boy's face, trapping the rising medicinal steam between his own body and the child's. "Breathe it," Gideon whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration against Leo's ear. "Fight for it, boy. Don't you close your eyes. Look at the fire. Look at the red." Leo's eyelids fluttered. His lips were cracked and pale, ringed with a faint, terrifying blue. He let out a weak whine, trying to turn his face away from the bitter heat. Gideon held the back of the boy's head with a hand big enough to palm a melon. His grip was firm, unyielding. No, you don't get to look away. You draw it in. From the corner of the room, Caleb and the other boys watched in absolute silence. They had never seen a man like this. He looked like a cornered grizzly, terrifying and desperate, fighting an invisible enemy with nothing but sheer, stubborn mass. Midnight passed. The wind outside finally began to settle into a low, mournful drone. Gideon didn't move. His back was a rigid line of tension. His flannel shirt was soaked through. He kept his head bowed, inhaling the same suffocating vapor as the boy forcing himself to share the torture. Around 2 a.m, the shift happened. It wasn't sudden. It was a subtle, gradual easing of the terrible friction. The rattling in Leo's chest grew softer, looser. The violent hitch in his breathing smoothed out into a ragged but steady rhythm. Gideon shifted his weight. He ran his calloused, dirt-stained thumb across the boy's forehead. The waxy, dry heat was gone. In its place was a thick, cooling layer of sweat. The fever had broken. Gideon closed his eyes. A long, shuddering breath escaped his nose. For 10 years he had carried the weight of a stone in his chest, a failure he couldn't outrun. He had let his own blood freeze. But tonight he had fought the mountain to a draw. He didn't celebrate. He just felt an exhaustion so deep it felt like his bones were turning to lead. He stood up slowly, his joints popping loudly in the quiet cabin. He walked over to the bed, carrying the sleeping, sweat-soaked boy. He laid Leo down on the heavy bear skin, pulling a dry wool blanket up to his chin. Nora watched him from the floor by the hearth. Her face was streaked with soot and dried tears. She looked at the giant man taking in his bleeding, scraped hands from clawing at the frozen roots, the dark bags under his eyes, the absolute vulnerability he had just exposed. Gideon walked back toward the fire. He didn't look at her. He kicked the copper boiler away from the heat with the side of his boot. "He'll sleep till tomorrow afternoon," Gideon said, his voice entirely flat, stripped of all energy. "Keep him warm. If he wakes up, give him broth. No meat." He walked over to his armchair, picked up his revolver from the side table, and moved toward the door. "Where are you going?" Nora asked, her voice cracking. "Woodshed," Gideon muttered. "Floor's hard. I need a smoke." He stepped out into the freezing dark, pulling the door shut behind him. Nora sat by the fire, listening to the steady, quiet breathing coming from the bed. She looked at the heavy iron chair where Gideon usually sat. It was empty, but for the first time since they had arrived, the cabin didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a fortress. Winter didn't leave the mountain. It just slowly lost its grip. January brought storms that buried the cabin up to the windowsills. February brought a cold so deep the pine trees sounded like rifle shots when their sap froze and expanded, cracking the bark. But inside the thick log walls, a strange, imperfect rhythm had taken hold. The silence that had haunted Gideon for a decade was dead. It was replaced by the constant chaotic noise of 5 boys, the scrape of wooden chairs, the thud of boots running across the floorboards, the endless, exasperating squabbles over who got the last piece of dried apple. At first, Gideon hated it. He barked orders, doled out chores with militant precision, and retreated to the woodshed whenever the noise breached his tolerance. He was a man accustomed to the predictable quiet of isolation. Living with 6 other human beings felt like trying to navigate a stampede in a narrow canyon. But slowly, the edges began to wear down. It started with Caleb. The 14-year-old had taken Gideon's harsh lesson in the snow to heart. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for breaks. Every morning before Gideon even had the coffee ground, Caleb was out at the woodpile. the heavy maul swinging in the pre-dawn dark. He learned how to read the grain of the pine, how to strike the knot so it split clean. One morning in late February, Gideon walked out onto the porch with 2 tin cups of boiling black coffee. He handed one to Caleb without a word. The boy took it, his hands blistered and raw, and nodded. They stood side by side on the frozen porch, watching the sun crest the far ridge entirely silent. It was an acknowledgement, a transfer of respect. Then came Wyatt. The 6-year-old had a shadow's persistence. Whenever Gideon sat down to mend a harness or sharpen a knife, Wyatt would silently appear, sitting cross-legged on the floor, exactly 2 feet away, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. "You're breathing on my elbow, boy," Gideon grumbled one evening, trying to thread a thick leather needle. Wyatt didn't move. "I'm watching." Gideon sighed heavily. He put the needle down. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folding pocket knife with a bone handle. He picked up a piece of soft cedar scrap from the floor. "You don't watch," Gideon said gruffly. "You do. Hold the wood away from your chest. Thumb on the back of the blade. Push, don't pull." He handed the knife to the boy. Wyatt took it like it was a holy relic. Across the room, Nora paused her sweeping, watching the massive scarred hands of the mountain man guide the tiny, fragile fingers of her brother. Nora's place in the cabin had changed too. She was no longer a captive laborer trying to buy her safety with frantic scrubbing. She became the quiet anchor of the house. She learned how to stretch Gideon's meat stores with wild onions and dried beans. She learned how to patch canvas trousers using sinew when the cotton thread ran out. Gideon never thanked her. That wasn't his way. But he stopped leaving the empty water pails by the door for her to carry. He started filling them himself before she woke. When he shot a deer in the lower valley, he didn't just bring back the meat. He brought back a bundle of dried sage and juniper berries, dropping them onto the kitchen table without making eye contact, knowing she liked the smell. One evening in March, the wind outside was howling a familiar, violent tune. The boys were asleep on the floor, a tangle of limbs and wool blankets. Gideon sat in his chair, greasing his boots. Nora sat at the table, mending a tear in Arthur's coat by the light of a single tallow candle. "Snow's getting heavy and wet," Gideon said, not looking up from his boots. "Means the pass will be clear in 3 weeks, maybe 4. Nora's needle stopped. The pass clearing meant the road to Oak Haven was open. It meant the town would come looking, or it meant Gideon could take them back down. "Are you taking us back to town?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white. Gideon rubbed a thick glob of bear grease into the leather seam. He didn't answer for a long time. The fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. "I bought 30 pounds of seed potatoes last fall," Gideon finally muttered. "Ground's gonna thaw soon. I ain't planting 'em alone. Takes a lot of hands to break that soil out back." He set the boot down and looked at her. His eyes, usually guarded and hard, held a quiet, reluctant warmth. "Table seats 8, Nora," he said softly. "I told you that the day I brought you up here. I ain't changing the furniture." Nora looked back down at her sewing. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. But her shoulders dropped, releasing a tension she had been carrying for 6 brutal months. She pushed the needle through the heavy fabric. "We'll need more hose," she said quietly. "Caleb is tall enough to use a full-size one now." Gideon nodded slowly. "I'll forge a new head for the broken handle tomorrow." By late April, the mountain bled. Snowmelt carved deep, muddy veins down the logging road, carrying the sharp, rot-sweet scent of decaying pine needles, and turned loam. The valley was a soggy, breathing thing. Out back, the sucking schlick-pop of Gideon's boots matched the rhythm of his heavy iron plough. Caleb trailed him, his fingernails caked in black dirt, dropping seed potatoes into the wet furrows. From the front porch, the sound drifted up. Slop. Slosh. Slop. Nora dropped her dripping washcloth into the tin basin. Two riders crested the ridge, their horses, blowing hard flanks, lathered in white, nervous foam. Benton and Higgins. "Gideon!" Her voice was a sharp crack against the damp air. Gideon left the plough. He didn't run. He walked with a heavy, deliberate gait, stopping by the chopping block to lift his felling axe. The hickory handle was smooth from years of sweat. He rested the heavy iron head on his shoulder, his chest heaving, his beard dusted with fresh dirt. Benton reined his horse in the muddy yard. He spat a stream of black tobacco juice that sizzled on a patch of lingering snow. "Well, I'll be damned," the rancher grunted. "Thought you'd have eaten 'em by January." "You're blocking my wagon path, Benton," Gideon rumbled. Higgins adjusted his spectacles, his knuckles white on the reins. "We're here on county business, Gideon. Winter's over. The boys are wards of the state. Benton here needs hands for the spring branding. He's taking the older two. The rest go to the Friday orphanage train." Benton leveled a thick finger at Caleb. "Pack your kit, boy." Caleb froze. The mud seemed to grip his boots. He looked at the massive rancher, then at Gideon's broad, dirt-stained back. The boy swallowed hard. He took one step forward, planting himself right beside Gideon's elbow. "I ain't going." Caleb's voice shook, but it didn't break. "We're 5 brothers." Benton let out a harsh, phlegmy laugh. "Nobody keeps more than 2. Not me and not this hermit. He can't feed you." Gideon slowly lowered the axe. The iron head hit the wet earth with a dull, heavy thud. He leaned his weight onto the handle. "I ain't a hermit," Gideon said softly. He took one step toward the horses. The massive draft animals flattened their ears. "The debt is paid. The paper is torn. You want cheap labor. Look somewhere else. You want these boys. You better step off that horse and try to take them." He didn't yell. The threat was a low, vibrating growl in his chest. Behind Gideon, Arthur and Samuel moved up to flank him. On the porch, Nora's hand slipped into her apron pocket, her thumb tracing the familiar edge of a paring knife. Benton looked at the giant man. He looked at the feral, unblinking eyes of the boys. He saw a wall of bone and spite. The rancher chewed his cigar, then yanked his reins hard. "Crazy bastard," Benton muttered. He kicked his horse, retreating down the muddy switchback. Higgins followed instantly. Gideon watched until the timberline swallowed them. Only then did his grip on the hickory handle loosen. He let out a long, ragged exhale. He turned to look at the muddy, shivering boys, then up at Nora on the porch. His throat felt tight. He cleared it with a rough cough. "Sun's burning daylight," Gideon grunted, pointing the axe toward the field. "Potatoes ain't planting themselves." As the boys scattered back to the furrows, Gideon walked to the porch to scrape his boots. He looked out over the dripping pines, the deep winter finally broken breathing in the noise of a full, chaotic mountain. If Gideon's unyielding stand to protect his newfound family made your heart pound, don't leave this mountain just yet. This raw tale of survival, trauma, and redemption proves that blood isn't the only thing that makes a family. Hit that like button to show your support for Gideon and the boys. Share this video with someone who loves a truly grounded Western story, and subscribe to the channel with notifications on, so you never miss another gritty adventure. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if Benton showed up at your door?